How's it going? Welcome to Group Thinkers. We're thrilled today. We're getting a different perspective today, Ronnie. We're getting a different perspective. So, Group Thinkers, just quick stage setter podcast from Arcady Group that is intended for nonprofit marketers. And by intended for, we mean it's just a conversation with. And so on each and every episode, we like to have someone who has a unique perspective on things that are happening in the space. And we definitely have that today. We're getting a different perspective because we're super excited to chat with Fiona James-Dambrosio from Doctors Without Borders Canada. Fiona, hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, no pressure.
No pressure, no pressure. Officially our first Canadian on the show. So no pressure behind that. Like that's something to celebrate. That's something for us to, we're
That's
really
exciting. I
excited.
didn't know that.
Yeah, we didn't want to tell you that before. We wanted to save all the good stuff for the conversation. So on our show today, in this episode, we're going to be chatting Gen X. We are wrapping up our 6th season of the podcast, and our focus this season on Gen X. And so I'm excited, Fiona, to learn a little bit about your journey, but then also talk with you about what you see happening in Canada, so that we can compare and contrast some of the things both among Gen X, but also just kind of now that I think I've heard people say post-pandemic. I don't know if we're still mid. I don't know where we are, but like over the last, year and a half or 2 years, as we've all pivoted far more than ever and used that word far more than we thought that we would. And so that's the goal for our time together today. Just for anyone who's tuning in, if you have not yet downloaded a copy of the Gen X study and you've listened to one or more of our episodes in the 6th season, I question your ability to use a browser because we've talked about it so much. So the domain, the URL is arcadygroup.com/Gen X. And yeah, Ronnie, anything else I need to hit at the top?
I don't think so. I think you've got it covered.
Thanks, man. I appreciate your encouragement today. We're recording this on a Monday. We got to build each other up. We were talking about Ted Lasso beforehand. And so, we've got to get some good uplifting moments out of our time today. Okay, so Fiona, here's where we're going to start. Your current role, you are the senior manager of direct marketing and donor engagement for MSF Canada. And so you've been there a couple of years, it seems like approaching 3 years. But I would love for you to go back to when you're leaving university and charting out your path, and just kind of tell us your journey to get to MSF.
Yeah, it's so as you mentioned, Senior Manager of Mass Marketing and Donor Engagement. It is a mouthful. And it is the portfolio that I currently manage, but not where I started. And it's been quite a journey, actually. I started 20 years ago, and it was in university that I actually really that's where, yeah, my career sort of took a turn. And using that word again, pivot, like there was a moment where that changed for me. I thought I was going to like be an art buyer and travel, and that was the career path that I was heading down. And I was working at this part-time job. So like I was in university, I needed cash like all other university students at the time. And so a friend of mine had referred me to a call center. And it was the first time that I had worked at a call center. And she kind of described it like it's a call center, but it's for good. And I kind of didn't really, I didn't really know what that meant. And it turned out that the good part was that it was a telemarketing company that exclusively worked with not-for-profits. And so I was hired to make calls. And the first portfolio that I actually worked on, the first charity that I worked for or represented, was World Vision. And that was like my real first foray into the charitable sector, and it's where I cut my teeth in fundraising. Like, it's where I got comfortable asking for money. It's where I got comfortable with rejection. When you're a fundraiser, there's a really great line that if you're being trained by a really good trainer, they'll tell you, you never let a yes get to your head, or a no get to your heart. And it's so true, because at the end of the day, you're representing these amazing causes, and that was where I think the love for not-for-profit came. And what solidified it for me was travel. I had the opportunity and was really fortunate to do quite a bit of traveling in my 20s, and just the exposure, I think, to different cultures and communities that are made vulnerable really by circumstance, and not because there is lack of agency or resilience. It's really just yeah, think external factors, and oftentimes like a confluence of factors that lead people into the circumstances that they're in. And that was when I came back after a little bit of travel. Spoke to my parents about it, and I'm a first generation immigrant. I wasn't born in Canada. I was actually born in Guyana. And my parents often remind me that when we landed and moved to Montreal, organizations like the Salvation Army were so crucial to helping our family settle. And one of my earliest memories, and my mother still reminds me to this day, is I used to complain about having like mismatched snowsuits, because like she would get pieces from like the church, and then she would get pieces from Salvation Army, and I used to hate it. But looking back now, like, those organizations were so critical, and the service that they provided was so important, to my family, that I think coming back, having that conversation with my parents, and feeling just a lot of gratitude and really grateful, it was an easy decision for me to say, you know what, like, this is the sector for me, and it's where I want to lay roots, and I want to try to, where I can, yeah, help organizations, you know, generate revenue so that they're able to deliver on their social mission. And so from telemarketing, I had some time in face-to-face as well, and then did the crossover from agency over to charity, and have worked with, or aligned myself with organizations where there's just like a values alignment, and naturally that tends to be organizations where there's some type of humanitarian thread. So yeah, so that's how it's been a long journey, but a really
Uh,
rewarding one.
I mean, incredibly rewarding, and you're very passionate about it, and we love that. Uh, Ronnie, I hope you wrote down the lesson that you learned from her fundraising mentors early on, that you never let a yes go to your head or a no go to your heart. That's going to come back around, if not in this conversation, probably later today in multiple meetings. But I just an observation as you talk about your journey. Um, you you cut your teeth in some of the more challenging areas of fundraising, right? Between
Yeah,
telemarketing, which, you know, even if you're telemarketing for good, there is this gap, this void when someone answers the phone, right? Before, like, after they say hello, there's this little void that you have to be able to learn how to break through. And then likewise, face to face, when you're approaching someone, and on a public square, et cetera, to
yeah.
have those conversations. Those are some really challenging areas, some very important areas, and I would I would guess that the number of lessons that you still carry today from those first two gigs are extensive.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think there's so many of them. And like, one of them is just like authenticity, right? Like, at the end of the day, if you are just bringing your genuine self to the conversation, and you're able to find something about the organization, and it's not hard. I mean, like, this is the thing, like, when we're talking about worthy causes, it's not hard to find something that you can feel really passionate about with most causes. And so for me, getting to choose some of the charities that I got to represent, that was important. And it's not hard to then have that conversation and say, like, the reason I'm calling today is because, and then to go on and share that case for support. I think it's something that comes really naturally when you are genuinely interested, in what the organization is doing, and where that money is going to go, and be able to explain that in a way, that is really simple for the donor too. Like, I think, like, that was the other thing, is the genuine piece, the passion and alignment, and really trying to find that thing that you love about the charity, because it's going to resonate with you, and then in turn, the way that you share that, your passion will obviously come across. And then the other one is, like, just the resilience of, like, the repetitive nature of those tasks. Like, you I think it's like, I think they say, like, it's 9 no's before you get that one yes. And just kind of accepting, that is the parameters under which you're going to be working. It helps to build that resilience. And so there's very few arguments that I lose with my husband, to be honest, because I'm just so, like, the one word he'll always use to describe me is relentless.
Mhm.
And it's true. I think it's really, it's, yeah. So to your point, like, there was just a lot of, lessons and a lot of skills, a lot of the softer skills that you don't get to exercise in your day to day, that, you walk away from, roles like that, and you all of a sudden have, like, this, like, tool belt of skills that you're going to be able to use in years to come.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have to tell you, you're among friends, both with Ronnie and I, but then also I think every guest we've ever had on the show, whenever we talk to them about their journey, and it's always a great place for us to start. Um, it's very rare that we chat with someone that says, I set out to work in the nonprofit space. Typically, it's a series of events that someone is either called to it or drawn to it, just depending on how you want to phrase it, that there are these kind of magnetic forces for us that pull us into the space. And certainly, as you reflected on parts of your adolescence and upbringing, and then the happenstance of someone referring you to work at the call center, right, that all of that kind of packages in together to you uncovering this heart for doing good and helping those that are in need, and from both your time at Plan, as well as at World Animal Protection, and now at MSF. That is something that you have clearly done and continue to do. And I think that the other thing that I'm drawn to whenever you're sharing your story is that there's a lot of your perspective that aligns well with some findings in our Gen X study. How's that for a segue? Okay, so we shared with you this study, and this study, we put this research project into the marketplace, and had a panel of US-based donors in late February, early March 2020, pre-pandemic, provide us these insights, and we've been able to package it and use it to just have discussions with people. And I think something that has been clear to us is that many people feel the need to acquire younger donors, and many people don't know how to. But I also think that there are these kind of interesting galvanizing principles of what people are taking away from the study, and how it's helping either inform or fuel strategies that they've already known or already put into place. And so I'm just curious, as you've looked at the Gen X study, what what are some similarities that you see between what we found in the US marketplace and what you see in Canada? And then also, what are some of the differences?
Yeah, so, that's a great question. And I think one of the things around being able to, take a look at your own database and measure against these surveys, which are always really interesting to me, is they can be really intimidating. And I'll start there because I think that one of, at least in the last 2 years, one of the challenges has been to find and carve out that space to actually survey our own database. And so I'm sure that MSF is not alone in this, but wanting to get a pulse on how things are going with our donors. And so we were fortunate enough that in 2019 we did our own affinity survey, and that survey went out to about 6,000 monthly and one-time donors. And so it's been a bit of time since those findings. So that's the survey, or at least the last real moment that we had an opportunity to kind of hear from our donors on a bigger scale, how they're feeling about everything from our fundraising activities to our communications. And so I mention it because it's the survey, and it's those findings coming out of that 2019 affinity survey that I'll sort of use to measure against what we're seeing at MSF. But also to say that we recognize that it has been a moment, and in that time there's been a pandemic. And so going into next year, one of the plans as part of our annual planning is to go back out with another survey next year. And I think doing that every few years is really, really important. So for organizations who haven't yet done it, don't be intimidated by it, but it is a good moment, I think, to check in and just, like I said, hear whether your fundraising activities are resonating, the modes of communication. So one of the things that came out of your survey was around forms of giving. So the various vehicles that people are currently donating to. And I think that is one of the bigger similarities that I found with our donor base. So the biggest sort of distinct difference in the MSF survey was between sort of the under 55s and then over 55s. And so it makes it a little bit challenging because that would be your older boomer, and then getting into, sorry, that would be your boomers and your older Gen Xers. So for me, I'm not able to fully break out the younger Gen Xers and the older Gen Xers the way that your survey did, which I found really, really interesting. And I'm sure that'll come up a little bit more as we talk about some of the differences. But what I did find was around the more mature donors, we tend to see our older Gen Xers as well as our boomers giving to vehicles like DAFs, family foundations, etc. Our younger supporters, and I don't know if this is mainly driven by financial planning, which, as you get a little bit older, you start to think a little bit more about traditional forms of investment, and that's where, family foundations and DAFs generally come up. Legacy giving, planned giving, gifts of stocks and securities, that tends to attract, at least from what we've seen as well in our survey, a more mature donor, and a donor who is, it's kind of like the empty nesters, and so our younger donors are generally attracted to events, and whether that's third-party events or your survey referenced GoFundMe's. That isn't something that we're doing right now at MSF, or any crowdfunding. But we are seeing that our younger donors, whether it's events or other types of collective crowdfunding type of fundraising, that's what they're doing as well.
I think it's interesting that you find the same thing, and you make a great point. There is some correlation between age versus just like this general, like you have your generational experiences in the time you grew up in, but then there's also just this kind of thing like when millennials become over 55, we'll probably see a lot of the same patterns of donor advised funds, assuming they're still around and whatnot. But you know, there's an age aspect to these things. So you know, you talked about the younger Gen X and older Gen X and kind of that divide there. You know, our study shows that these younger Gen Xers and millennials, they grew up in this time of the internet, and they have this kind of opening to the world that older donors didn't have. And so you see this in some of the things in the study where, you know, they're connected to more global causes, and they're connected to these social movements in connection with probably the rise of social media. As an organization, you know, how does Doctors Without Borders, how do you tap into this idea of like, hey, we're a global organization, and you know, how do you tap into that and attract these younger donors?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. And you know, one of the things that I was gonna mention around age is like this idea that, because I think for me the findings is one thing, but it's always like what's driving, right? Like what's driving the behavior, what's driving the psychology behind behind it. And I think one of the things around age is the millennials and younger Gen Xers, to your point, are growing up in a time where, even around like when you think about financial planning, and you know, they're growing up where there's platforms like Wealthsimple and Questrade, where it's almost like direct to consumer, and they have been socialized to kind of bypass a lot of these like third party, like middle sort of third party, um I organizations or companies that help in that way, and they want to see the impact of that happen right away. And I think that is also shaping the kinds of organizations that they are typically drawn to. So you know, one of the things that our own survey showed is there was a difference between the kinds of organizations or the motivations behind giving. So for example, our older donors, you know, they tend to give out of this sense of duty, and it's something that I've talked a little bit about before, where our younger donors are looking for, you know, social impact causes. You know, they care about migration and refugee causes and displacement. And so for me, I think that I don't know whether that's just the age of internet, or if it's also just the age that the time that we're living in right now, um, with Twitter and you know, with Snapchat and everything else, like all of these other social media platforms, access to what's happening in the world is just, it's happening in such real time in a way that it didn't happen before. And the exposure that audience is having on incredibly important social issues is like right at their fingertips at all moments. So I think that is where there's a real big difference and gap in terms of the kinds of charities also that the younger donors are really passionate about. You know, it tends to be these like really big movement causes, and whether that's climate, or you know, whether that is right now, you know, a big push towards you know, dismantling you know, racism, and really trying to, you know, push organizations to think differently also about their own responsibilities around that. I think like that is, I think, what is really motivating and fueling a lot of the decisions they make around the charities that they want to give to.
There's this thing that comes to mind, Fiona, as you're sharing that. You know, one of our research partners, they had put out a study in 2018 where they talked about that, um, essentially generations, they swing like pendulums, right? And so the way that I've described this previously is that, you know, if you go back to the old sitcom Family Ties, you have the hippie parents and then the kind of Reagan conservative kid. So it's this interesting paradox between Alex P. Keaton, played by Michael J. Fox, and his parents, right? They complement each other, but then they also they see the world differently. And so the study actually went on to prove that this is the case in multiple ways, and that, you know, if you go back from pre-boomer to the silent generation. And so the silent generation has a certain set of ideas and beliefs. And so some more appreciation for structure and independence and those things. And then you swing into boomer, and the really I think many times we forget that the boomers were on the forefront of so much change, right? Of social change and of civic change. And throughout the 60s and early 70s, the boomer audience really ignited new ways of thinking. And so that swung the other way. And then you swing back to maybe some structure and independence amongst Gen X, and that's validated even whenever we see in our study the fierce independence that comes out of some of the older Gen X. And then you go from there back into millennials, this kind of pursuit of change. I was doing some reading over the weekend about charities accepting cryptocurrency and being on the forefront of new, as you said, new giving technologies, while not ignoring the old. Right? You can't ignore the old, but you still want to be on the forefront of ways to connect with people so that you can show them not only are you a part of a movement to solve really complex problems and actually solve them, but also that you're doing it in a way that's relevant for what's going on around them.
Yeah, your survey covered, gifts by method. So how are people giving to charities, whether that's through direct mail, appeals, telemarketing, online, social media, events, for example. And I think one of the things that the report was showing was that younger Gen Xers tend to index higher on things like email and social media. Interestingly enough, they also tend to respond differently to phone than what I'm seeing actually with our study. Younger Gen Xers in your report less likely to respond to telemarketing, where one of the things that came out, or at least that we're seeing at MSF, is our younger donors, because they're really hungry for information, but they want these like bite-sized, almost like give me the sound bite, they've actually been responding better to phone, specifically around things like SMS, than our older, let's say, Gen Xers, which is an interesting piece for me. And I don't know if that's because, again, with the sort of the not even rise at this point of mobile, but just charity seeing that being mobile responsive is first of all, it's critical at this point. But because we're really moving away from desktop and over to mobile, we're finding that there's a bit of a this resurgence of donors who are younger and actually interested in hearing from us on SMS, and they'd prefer to get a quick upgrade SMS to just say like, hey, here's a way that you can engage by increasing your monthly donation and help X, Y, and Z. And they're used to this kind of like one-click action that we are finding is making a bit of a comeback on phones.
I received 2 text messages last week from Heifer International, and they were announcing to me their holiday catalog. As opposed to mailing it to me, they were texting me about it, and it had all the cute emojis in it, right? That would grab my attention whenever I'm looking at even the preview of the text. And then obviously had links to go through, and I screenshotted that multiple times and then shared it out, because to your point, like it's about relevancy and knowing that. I think now, especially now, as we're 18 months into the pandemic, we're all far more digitally connected than we were 18 months ago. We're all far more able to do things, and it's only accelerated those that were somewhat digitally connected beforehand. And so, yes, things like SMS have a resurging relevancy for younger donors. As you think about or reflect on the last 19 or 20 months, what are some of the the pivots that MSF put in place as a result of COVID, and how has that changed the way that you communicate with donors or prospective donors, and kind of what are you leaning into right now, post pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, like many organizations, I think it was a real moment for MSF. I've talked about the various investment channels and fundraising channels that we use to reach Canadians and try to expand our acquisition and introduce MSF to more donors. The majority of that has been in face to face, and so March, I won't forget the day, but like March 16th, 2020, we pulled all of our face-to-face activities were pulled on that day across the country. And that was a significant moment because it wasn't necessarily all of our eggs in sort of the face-to-face basket. Luckily for us, we had a relatively diverse mix of channels and ways of reaching our donors, but it really accelerated our plans in digital. So we were in the second year of a strategic plan with plans to accelerate on digital, but not for another year or two. And all of a sudden, we were in this moment where we had to do that. And so it was less of a strategic pivot, to be honest, and it was like um, it was a very reactive thing, and we refocused and recentered everything around digital. And I think it was less about trying to figure out how we were going to reach these young audiences, which all of a sudden was like out the window. It was now just a matter of like, how are we just going to reach anyone, and what's the messaging we're going out with, and how are we going to put the right messaging in front of the right audiences. Um, those conversations were the ones that were happening, and not so much the really strategic ones where I think now that we feel like we've been able to exhale a little, and whether we want to say like we're in this period of things kind of resuming and going back to like this period of like normalcy, we're able at least at this moment to have some more strategic conversations about what are we going to do about this growing database of older donors, that at some point are going to be transferring. There's going to be, we talk about the transfer of wealth that's going to be happening. How are we actually reaching those younger audiences? Because I think the last 2 years has been such a blur, and really the focus was less on thinking strategically by audience, and it was more just thinking, what do we need to do to ensure that we have a robust digital portfolio, that we have we're driving all of these people to our website. Is the website optimized? And when we're looking at that conversion funnel, like, are we doing all of the things you're supposed to do? And the answer was no. And I'm sharing that because it's a big piece of one of the areas we're going to focus on next year is a website redesign. We know that we're losing a certain amount of donors. We're driving a lot more people to the website than we ever have, and it's not where it needs to be at the moment. And so that's a project that we're going to be focusing on. We're also building out the capacity internally to support. So it's one thing to say, okay, we've got to focus on digital, but how are we actually going to do that? And what are the roles and the portfolios that are going to be important to focus on? And then recruiting for those, I think, is going to be really important. So when I think about the digital focus for us, it's recruitment, it's building the capacity to support a lot of the initiatives that we want to do. It's bringing those skill sets in-house. It's aligning ourselves with agency partners that can help get us there, that have the vision alignment that we have, because it's you know I would be lying if I say, I know I've got my finger on the pulse of what's happening in digital. That's just not the case. When we're looking at mass marketing, there's a number of different channels, and that's where I think having external partners that can really help support that work in a meaningful way is really important. So we have just we've just done that as well, and are going to be working with RKD in the new year. And that's not intended to be a plug, but it's really just I think looking inward, but also externally. Where can we get the supports and identify the different skill sets that are currently gaps on our team, um, so that we can be a lot more mindful and intentional about the way that we are building our digital plan for next year.
There's so much of what you just shared that I think I put under reimagination, and that's, as you said, we're going on 2 years of what's essentially disaster response fundraising.
Yeah.
Everything that we've done for the last 2 years has been in in that mode of there's something that's really important, really big, really all encompassing that's happening, and we're all affected by it. So you're trying to constantly react, and it's really hard to get ahead when you're in constant reaction mode. And so I totally agree with you, Fiona, is that now it feels like there's a little calming of the waters, in that we can take a step back and reimagine, okay, now what do we need to do? And knowing that digital has accelerated at the pace that it has now for 2 years, you gotta lean further in there. Like, that's gotta be a focus for every organization of how do we, rethink the way that we communicate through our website? How do we make sure that organic social is performing the way that it should? How do we make sure that we're getting, the right resource from the field to be able to communicate the stories? And then how do we make sure that the messages that we're communicating are appropriate by audience? So it's no longer message by channel, but it's message by audience to each of the various audiences through digital. So I think, all of those things are the things that I would challenge every one of our nonprofit marketing listeners to pay attention to and to clue in on, is, where you can right now. And I know that it's year end and it's super busy, and but take a half step back and try to clear some headspace towards being more digital first. And so recognizing that that's a journey for everybody, but it's a really important journey that you got to put one foot out in front of the other and go down.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would add is, this idea of digital first. Like for me, um, it's the integration piece. And I think that that's the piece. It's like, it doesn't matter whether you are investing in face-to-face or telemarketing or direct mail, or DRTV, for example, third-party events, whatever it is, it's digital in everything, actually, right? And so it's helping to lift all of those other channels, and there is absolute digital integration in all of those pieces, whether it's in digital, for example, saying, we sent you a text, did you get it? Or it's the email primers that go out before a direct mail campaign. It is the integration between a DRTV campaign and your website, and digital there. It's donor journey. It's touching on. It's so integrated and embedded in helping to boost and optimize all of those other channels, that I almost look at it as digital in everything, rather than necessarily digital first, because I think there's a place for those other channels that that are reaching audiences that may not necessarily be as responsive in digital. So they may see the information on digital, but then convert in a different channel. But it has its place in helping, I think, to lift response in those channels.
You kind of mentioned keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening with digital and with marketing in general, and it kind of strikes me as sometimes in digital, as you're putting your finger on the pulse, the vein maybe keeps moving on you a little bit. It keeps changing, and it's so difficult. And I think that speaks to the challenge of what you're dealing with right now. And like, to sum it up succinctly, it's just that marketing in general is getting harder and it's getting more difficult. I mean, do you feel the same?
Yeah, 100%. One of the challenges is the cost to acquire on digital. It's a challenging one, so there are a number of things, as we all know, that we're bracing ourselves for. iOS changes that are coming, a cookieless world, that being the case because more people are using mobile. There's all of these different things that, for me, I really lean heavily on our external partners, to help us navigate that, and I think that if you are a smaller to mid-sized organization, finding the right partner to help you navigate some of those big changes that are going to make it even more difficult to optimize in digital, is going to be really important, and that's where we are right now. Um, One of the things I would say about that is it becomes more difficult to then plan for your investments when in digital there's such huge potential, but unlike some of the other channels, there's no guarantee that when you make a certain investment in digital that you're going to see that return on investment. We know that a digital donor tends to have a higher average gift, and then in terms of lifetime value, they have a more significant lifetime value than the other channels. So it's absolutely worth the investment in digital. But it's a hard it's a hard space to navigate without having that expertise, and so that's where, working with some of the external partners that we work with, and preparing us and helping us navigate some of those changes, because it's going to be more difficult, to acquire the same number of donors next year.
Yeah, it's getting harder, and in some cases, it's getting more expensive, and so, but I'm encouraged in like you said, I think that when you can align on vision and you can properly, put the limbs on the side of the organization, that we can all grow together. And so, I think that's a good spot to be. Fiona, as we, kind of land the conversation today, I just got to say thank you. Honestly, your insights and your vision for what you're doing at MSF are refreshing. I think that they're things that many of our listeners need to hear. A couple of things that I jotted down just as kind of three things that stood out to me. I'm going to say it again because I was really struck by it. Not to let every yes go to your head, or any yes go to your head, or any no go to your heart. That's probably a good lesson for all of us, like to just have on a Post-it note, put up on our screens, or written on a mirror or something like that. Something that Fiona shared that I think is incredibly important is to be mindful about the way that we talk to our donors, but maybe even more mindful about listening to our donors. So the survey that you mentioned, Fiona, that MSF has put into the market and that you plan to continue to put into the market, the power of listening to our donors can help in so many ways, and being able to leverage that information. And then the last is digital and everything, and that it's no longer this bifurcated world of offline and online. Like it's all one big Jarvis that we're wrestling with here. And so I think we appreciate the way that you're thinking about it and the way that you're helping lead the mass market team at MSF, and the things that you're on the verge of breaking through in terms of your strategies. And so thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat with us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Ronnie, this wraps up season 6, man. Thanks for being along the ride as well. And like I mentioned, folks can download the study. The study's going to live on at rkdgroup.com/GenX. You can find stuff about it all in RKD Group social channels. And I don't know what else to say except for I think we need some appropriate Gen X music. Hopefully we can have some good Gen X music to fade out. Some Don't You Forget About Me. I've got my flannel on, so this is kind of like my ode to Breakfast Club, get the little like fist walking away thing.
Should have worn neon today. I didn't know.
There's still time. If you want to run grab something, we can
add that in digitally, right?
Yeah, post yeah, digital and everything. So we'll just put some neon
overlay it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody. We'll see y'all down the road.